Hey, this is Brett, and you're watching Brett and Some Books. Today we are finishing The Mysteries of History, Unraveling the Truth from the Myths of Our Past by Graeme. This chapter is called What Lit the Great Fire of Chicago, Cow or Comet? The city of Chicago was ravaged by a fire that broke out around 9 p.m. on the night of October 8th, 1871. It ranks high on the list of urban conflagrations in the history of the United States. By the time the fire was on the wane, nearly 4 square miles of the city had been razed to the ground, leaving up to 300 dead, over 100,000 homeless, and a cleanup bill of $222 million, approximately $4.5 billion in today's money. Even before the embers had cooled, rumors were blaming the conflagration on the O'Leary family of DeKoven Street, blaming that the fire had been started in a barn to the rear of that property when a drunken Catherine O'Leary's ineptitude at the milking of her cow had caused the belligerent bovine to kick over a lamp she had carelessly left on the straw-strewn floor. No matter the early refutations of this maliciously inspired nonsense, the notion of a simple cow bringing down the city of Chicago gripped the collective imagination, with Brian Wilson writing in his Mrs. O'Leary's Cow track for the Beach Boys' initially unreleased Smile album as recently as 1967. One of the first fire outbreaks attended to that night was indeed at a barn to the rear of the O'Leary residence at 137 DeKoven Street. The fire marshal in attendance later testified, "We got the fire under control and it would not have gone a foot further, but the next thing I knew was that they came and told me that St. Paul's Church, about 2 squares north, was on fire. The team rushed to attend that event, but as that same fire marshal recalled, on arrival, the next thing I knew when I was there was that the fire was over at Batum's planing mill. Buildings far beyond the line of fire and in no contact with it burst into flames from the interior. If nothing else, this fire marshal's testimony makes clear that the legend of the disaster having been started by Catherine O'Leary's cow kicking over her lamp can be safely dismissed, especially as the journalist who first published the story would later have to admit to its invention. The Irish Catholic contingent of Chicago was not held in high regard by the Protestant elite, so a scapegoat, or perhaps a scapecow, from that community fitted the bill nicely. With history books very focused on the Great Fire of Chicago, there is often little mention of the fact that this was not the only fire in the area of the American Great Lakes that night. The townships of Port Huron and White Rock, both at the southern end of Lake Huron, were pretty much wiped out the same night, as were those of Holland and Manistee on Lake Michigan. Across the lake from Manistee and Holland was the site of a fire so massive that it dwarfed all the others put together, the largely forgotten fire of Peshtigo, which killed around 2,500 people, destroyed a dozen surrounding villages, and over 1.5 million acres of woodland. It was unquestionably the worst fire in American history. So how did it all get overshadowed by the Great Chicago Fire? At its peak, the Peshtigo Fire presented the awesome sight of a towering wall of flames across a 5-mile front, with temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, reaching speeds of over 100 miles per hour. Trains were melted where they stood, while buildings and their fleeing occupants were burned before the fire had even reached them. As was the case across the waters in Chicago, the Peshtigo event was marked by multiple and diverse fires, which, erupting at random across a wide area, left the people at a loss as to the direction in which to flee. Many who sought sanctuary in the nearby rivers and lakes either drowned or died of hypothermia. The subsequent study of the fire, with its prevailing conditions and the fire tornadoes it created, produced what is still known as the Peshtigo paradigm, a blueprint for how to reproduce the holocaustic conditions that wiped out Peshtigo. This study was used by the U.S. Air Force and British Bomber Command to generate the firestorms in their Second World War incendiary bombing of Dresden and Tokyo, which inflicted death tolls to dwarf those of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. The most intriguing aspect presented by this collection of fires is the fact that, when viewed from the air or plotted out on a map, they present a spread pattern similar to a shotgun blast to a solid surface from a shallow angle. This led some to consider a culprit far more mysterious than Mother O'Leary's cow, the blistering hot debris falling from Biela's comet, which also broke up over the area that night. First mooted in 1883, the comet theory was roundly dismissed, mainly because the man who had put forward the theory was Ignatius Loyola Donnelly, a U.S. congressman and amateur scientist widely perceived, with some justification, as a bit of a crank. In Donnelly's favor were the countless witness reports of balls of fire falling from the sky that night and spontaneous ground-level ignitions of blue flame, which Donnelly maintained were consistent with methane found in comets and comet debris. More recently, the American physicist Dr. Robert Wood took up Donnelly's long-abandoned gauntlet and in 2004 presented his conclusions to the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, asserting that there was, after all, much to support the notion that this cluster of fires had indeed been started by Biela's breakup cluster, showering the area with white-hot debris as this, and only this, squared with what so many eyewitnesses uniformly recalled at the time. Soon after the fires came the publication of The History of the Great Conflagration in 1871 by John Washington Sheehan and George Putnam Upton, two local historians who collected and meticulously logged local accounts of the night. They reported recollections of what happened in a village near Peshtigo, but a few minutes after 9 o'clock, and by singular coincidence precisely the time at which the Chicago fire commenced, the people of the village heard a terrible roar. It was that of a tornado crashing through the forests. Instantly the heavens were illuminated with a terrible glare. The sky, which had been so dark a moment before, burst into clouds of flame. A spectator of the terrible events said the fire did not come upon them gradually from burning trees and other objects to the windward, but from a whirlwind of flames and great clouds from above the tops of the trees. Others were equally adamant that the fire came in great sheets of flame from the heavens, and also spoke of a pitiless rain of fire and hot sand from the skies. Many also spoke of great balls of fire falling from the sky. The whole sky was filled with them, great smoky masses about the size of a large balloon, and traveling at unbelievable speed. They fell to the ground and burst. As to those mentions of searing hot sand, this was addressed in the book of Mrs. O'Leary's Comet, 1985, by Mel Waskin, head writer and science producer for the Chicago-based Coronet Educational Films. Knowing that meteors can bring in their wake showers of silica, Waskin observed, "There was sand on the beaches, but the beaches lay to the east and the wind was blown from the west and the south. There was no sand on the floor of the forest, nor on the farmlands of Wisconsin." It is true that, in the main, debris from space is usually cold by the time it hits Earth, and that many such visitors from space of modest size are destroyed by their passage through the Earth's atmosphere, resulting in them falling as sand. Other, larger ones, however, have in the past and more recently made it through that barrier to inflict significant Earth impact with accompanying fires. On the 29th of August 2011, a single such object was observed leaving a flaming trail as it passed over the Peruvian city of Cuzco to crash into the tinder-dry forests in the south of the city, immediately bursting into flames. Much the same happened on the 11th of August 2013 in the forest adjacent to the sound of Çanakkale in Turkey. In a major event, such as the disintegration of Biela's comet, hundreds or even thousands of individual pieces of varying size would have resulted, some burning up to fall as the much-cited hot sand at Peshtigo, while larger ones made it to Earth to start fires. In 1893, the journalist Michael Ahern finally admitted his libel of O'Leary's cow, but by then no one was listening. At least Mrs. O'Leary and her cow finally received official exoneration from the Chicago City Council, which in October 1997 held a somewhat belated and rather tongue-in-cheek ceremony. The cow, it was proclaimed, had been the victim of bad press. And for the sidebar, despite the rather obvious clue that their home had survived the catastrophe, the O'Leary's lives became unbearable as they were routinely beset by reporters and other more hostile mobs, all of which forced the family to decamp to the city's notorious South Side to avoid further persecution. In one of those strange twists of history, this enforced exile proved the making of O'Leary's family's fortunes and laid the foundations for Chicago's reputation in the field of organized crime. Within a few years of the family's move, Catherine's son, James, was running errands for the local bookmakers and organizing the violent extraction of monies due from punters reluctant to keep up with their payments. By the opening of the 1900s, Big Jim O'Leary had carved out his empire of illegal gambling and racketeering, and, a multimillionaire, he was one of the city's richest celebrities. His partnership with syndicate boss Johnny Torrio took him to great heights and set up Chicago as the ideal stage onto which would walk Torrio's lieutenant, Al Capone. That's the end of this chapter. I see that I said that it was the end, but that was not accurate. We got two more, and if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and check out the next couple of chapters. Thank you.